Stop imagining Elizabeth Taylor. Erase the Hollywood glamour, the heavy eyeshadow, and the superficial vanity that pop culture has force-fed you for the last century. Because the real woman behind the myth was far more terrifying and infinitely more brilliant than any movie star could ever hope to portray. If you strip away the romanticized veneer, you find a story not of love, but of ruthless, cold-blooded survival in a world where your own siblings were your deadliest predators. The philosopher Blaise Pascal once famously said that if her nose had been just a little shorter, the entire face of the world would have changed, implying that her beauty was the hinge upon which history turned. But Pascal was wrong. It wasn't her face that brought the Roman Republic to its knees. It was a weapon far sharper and more dangerous than any sword in the legions of Rome. We are talking about the last pharaoh of Egypt, a woman who spoke 9 languages when her ancestors refused to learn even one. A naval commander, a scholar, and a master manipulator who played the most powerful men on earth like pawns on a chessboard. But before we reveal the tragic and violent crescendo of her life, we must understand the blood-soaked soil from which she grew, because the ending of her story was written long before she was even born. To understand Cleopatra, you must first step into the opulent, rotting heart of the Ptolemaic dynasty. This was not the ancient Egypt of the pyramid builders. This was a Greek occupation, a lineage descending from one of Alexander the Great's generals, Ptolemy. For 300 years, this family ruled from Alexandria, the cultural capital of the ancient world, a city that smelled of papyrus, salt spray, and immense wealth. But inside the golden walls of the palace, the air reeked of metallic blood. The Ptolemies practiced a tradition of incestuous marriage to keep the bloodline pure, wedding brother to sister in a grotesque mimicry of the gods. The result was not divinity, but insanity and paranoia. Fathers murdered daughters, mothers poisoned sons, and siblings slaughtered one another for a scrap of power. Born in 69 BC, Cleopatra VII watched this carnage with wide, observant eyes. She knew that in this family, you were either the butcher or the cattle, and she had no intention of being led to the slaughter. While her family indulged in excess, she spent her youth in the great library of Alexandria, absorbing philosophy, astronomy, and rhetoric. She was the first of her dynasty to actually bother learning the Egyptian language, a strategic masterstroke that endeared her to the millions of native subjects her family had ignored for centuries. Her first test of survival came swiftly and brutally when her father died, leaving the 18-year-old Cleopatra to co-rule with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. But in the shark tank of Egyptian politics, sharing power was a death sentence. Her brother, guided by a cabal of corrupt advisors, the eunuch Pothinus and the general Achilles, maneuvered to strip the young queen of her throne. They painted her as a traitor, a woman who had sold out Egypt to the rising power of Rome. Forced into exile, stripped of her crown and her home, she fled to the burning sands of Syria. Most rulers would have crumbled, fading into obscurity as historical footnotes. But Cleopatra began to assemble an army of mercenaries. She stood in the blistering heat of the desert, gazing back toward the Nile Delta, plotting a return that would require not just steel, but a seismic shift in the geopolitical landscape. That shift arrived in the form of a Roman civil war spilling onto Egyptian shores. The great Roman general Pompey, fleeing his rival Julius Caesar, sought sanctuary in Egypt, believing the young pharaoh Ptolemy would shelter him. Instead, as Pompey stepped off his boat, the Egyptians beheaded him in plain sight of his wife and children, hoping to curry favor with Caesar. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria, he was not impressed by the gift of Pompey's severed head. He was disgusted. He was a Roman, and to see a fellow Roman general butchered by foreign treacherous advisors offended his sense of honor. He seized the royal palace and demanded the feuding siblings reconcile. This was the moment Cleopatra had been waiting for. But she was trapped behind enemy lines, with her brother's army blocking her path to the city. She needed to get into the palace, past the guards, and directly into Caesar's quarters. The legend tells of her being rolled into a carpet, but historical accounts suggest something even more claustrophobic and daring: a simple laundry sack. Imagine the sensory deprivation, the smell of rough fabric, the utter helplessness of being carried on the back of a servant through a city that wanted you dead. One wrong move, one curious guard, and the Queen of Egypt would have been run through with a spear. But the gamble paid off. When the sack was opened in Caesar's private chambers, the 52-year-old dictator of Rome found himself face to face with the 21-year-old exile. She didn't just offer him her body. She offered him Egypt, its grain, its wealth, and the stability he desperately needed to fund his wars. By the next morning, when her brother arrived, he found Cleopatra not in chains, but standing beside Caesar. The boy king threw his diadem on the ground and wept in a rage. But it was too late. The alliance was sealed in blood and ambition. The ensuing war for Alexandria was brutal. The great library burned, casting a pall of ash over the city, and the Nile ran red with the blood of soldiers. In the end, Cleopatra's brother drowned in the river, weighed down by his golden armor, a fittingly heavy end for a puppet king. Now undisputed ruler, Cleopatra bore Caesar a son, Caesarion, declaring to the world that the blood of the pharaohs and the blood of Rome had merged. She traveled to Rome, staying in Caesar's villa, parading her wealth and exoticism before a scandalized Roman Senate. They called her a whore and a sorceress, terrified by the influence this foreign queen held over their leader. She was a living goddess, walking among men who prided themselves on their republic. But the Ides of March shattered her ambitions. When Caesar was stabbed 23 times on the Senate floor, Cleopatra realized her protector was gone. Rome instantly transformed from a playground of power into a trap. She fled back to Egypt, knowing that the vacuum left by Caesar would soon suck the entire Mediterranean into chaos. From the ashes of the Roman Republic rose two men: Octavian, Caesar's cold and calculating nephew, and Mark Antony, his brilliant but hedonistic general. Cleopatra, ever the strategist, knew she needed a new shield against the encroaching power of Rome. She chose Antony. But she didn't just send a letter. She staged a piece of theater that would be talked about for millennia. When summoned to meet Antony in Tarsus, she arrived on a golden barge with purple sails, the oars made of silver beating time to the sound of flutes and lyres. She dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, reclining under a gold-embroidered canopy, while boys dressed as cupids fanned her. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and incense, drifting across the water to meet the Roman general. Antony, a man of simple appetites and vast ego, was instantly ensnared. This wasn't just seduction. It was a projection of absolute power and divine right. She was telling him that she was not a vassal to be conquered, but a goddess to be worshipped. For years, they lived in a state of delirious excess. They formed a drinking society called the Inimitable Livers, feasting and partying while the political noose tightened around their necks. They had 3 children together, dreaming of an Eastern empire that would rival Rome. But in the West, Octavian was using this relationship as a weapon. He launched a propaganda campaign that would make modern spin doctors blush, painting Antony as a man emasculated by a foreign witch, a traitor who had abandoned his Roman values for Egyptian decadence. The inevitable collision happened at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. It was a disaster. As the fleets engaged in the churning waters, confusion reigned. Seeing the battle turning against them, Cleopatra's flagship hoisted its sails and fled. Antony, seeing his queen retreat, abandoned his men and followed her, sealing their fate. It was the moment the lion became a broken man, choosing love over duty and ensuring their total destruction. They retreated to Alexandria, waiting for the end, as Octavian's legions marched relentlessly toward Egypt. The atmosphere in the palace was no longer one of parties, but of impending doom. They formed a new society, companions in death, vowing to die together rather than be paraded in chains through the streets of Rome. When Octavian finally arrived, the tragedy played out with operatic intensity. Antony, receiving false news that Cleopatra had already committed suicide, drove his sword into his own stomach. But the blow didn't kill him immediately. In a scene of horrific agony, he was hoisted up into the mausoleum where Cleopatra had barricaded herself, dying in her arms, his blood staining her royal robes. The great general was gone, and now Cleopatra stood alone against Octavian. Octavian was immune to her charms. He didn't want a lover, he wanted a trophy. He planned to drag her to Rome to display her like a caged animal in his triumph. For a woman who considered herself the living incarnation of Isis, this was a fate worse than death. The end came swiftly and mysteriously. While legend speaks of an asp, an Egyptian cobra, smuggled in a basket of figs, historians argue it was likely a potent toxic cocktail she carried in a hollow hair comb. The method matters less than the motive. It was an act of ultimate defiance. When Octavian's guards broke down the doors, they found her dead on a golden couch, dressed in her full royal regalia, her 2 handmaidens dying at her feet. She had denied Rome its final victory. She left the world as she had lived in it, on her own terms, untouched by the hands of lesser men. With her last breath, the Ptolemaic dynasty crumbled, and Egypt became a mere province of the Roman Empire. The sun set on 3,000 years of pharaonic history. Octavian tried to erase her memory, tearing down her statues and slaughtering her son Caesarion. But he failed. He could conquer her land, but he could not conquer her legend. She remains a figure of endless fascination, not because of her beauty, but because of her sheer, unadulterated will to power. In a world dominated by men who resolved conflicts with swords, she fought with her mind, holding the weight of an empire on her shoulders until the very bitter end. And as the centuries pass, The stone monuments of her conquerors erode into dust. Yet the name Cleopatra still echoes as loudly as it did 2,000 years ago. A lingering reminder that history is not just written by the victors, but by those who dare to make the world tremble.